On the 24th of July, 1944, the order was still in effect. Army Group North officially held Narva. Headquarters demanded that the line be held. Hitler personally called the army headquarters and repeated one word: stand. But by that morning, in the trenches near the Sinime Heights, 3 German divisions combined had fewer men than one division was supposed to have. Shells were delivered intermittently. Dressing stations had long been overflowing. And on that day, the Soviet command still had 6 fresh divisions in reserve, which had not yet entered the battle. The order to hold existed. The possibility of fulfilling it was shrinking with every hour. To understand why this order appeared at all and why it was not canceled even when it turned into a death sentence for thousands of people, one must return to the beginning of 1944. To the moment when the map and the ground diverged so far for the first time that the gap between them began to be measured not in meters, but in lives. January 1944. For 3 years, German troops had maintained the blockade of Leningrad. For 3 years, a line existed on the maps of the Wehrmacht High Command that was considered stable. Over these years, stability had become a habit, and habit, a conviction. The staff officers of Army Group North had grown accustomed to looking at the same drawing of the front. The Gulf of Finland to the north, Lake Ladoga to the east, Leningrad like a knot that does not move. And the German positions themselves dug into the ground so deep that they seemed to have become part of the landscape. This immobility was deceptive. Over 3 years of defense, a fatigue had accumulated in the troops that no report reflected. Losses were replenished slowly and incompletely. The divisions stationed near Leningrad since '41 were staffed at 60, sometimes 50% of their authorized strength. Artillery was worn out. Horses, the main draft force of the German army on the Eastern Front, were depleted and sick. A figure rarely mentioned, by January '44, Army Group North had just over 40,000 horses in service, although 3 times as many were needed for full supply. The Red Army knew this, not through agents, through simple arithmetic. 3 years in the same positions under the Soviet climate do to troops what no order can fix. They tire of fighting not only the enemy but also the mud, the cold, the distance, the rot in the trenches, and the endless uncertainty. The Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, by this time, on the contrary, had undergone several reorganizations, received new equipment, and, most importantly, had accumulated the operational experience they lacked in '41. On the 14th of January 1944, the Red Army struck from several directions at once. The operation was called January Thunder. Its scale was underestimated by the German command, not because intelligence did not warn, it did, but because 3 years of stability had developed a reflex whereby any threat was perceived as another local attack that could be repelled by reinforcing one sector. The blow turned out not to be local. Within weeks, Soviet troops advanced distances that had not changed for years. The blockade of Leningrad was finally lifted. German units retreated where they had never retreated before, to the west, through Estonia, to the Narva River. And here, for the first time, a word appeared that would become the main word on this sector of the front several months later: Narva. The city stands where the river of the same name makes a turn before flowing into the Gulf of Finland. Forests and swamps approach from the east. From the west, Estonia, flat fields and roads to Tallinn. The city itself is small. Before the war, about 25,000 people lived there. But its geographical position made it what it became in February '44, the only narrow place through which Soviet troops could move further west along the coast of the Gulf of Finland. Why this was so important for Berlin is a separate question, and the answer lies not on the map of Estonia, but on the map of the entire northern part of the Eastern Front. Since the summer of 1941, Finland had been fighting against the Soviet Union on Germany's side. Formally, this was called the Continuation War. The Finns tried to emphasize that their goal was limited, to regain the territories lost in 39-40. But the fact remained, the Finnish army held the front north of Leningrad and tied down significant Soviet forces. Without Finland, the German positions in the north would have collapsed even in '41. Now, in February '44, Germany's connection with Finland depended on several factors. One of them, the Baltic Sea. German ships supplied Finland, and the Finnish and German armies coordinated actions by land through Estonian territory. If Soviet troops broke through Narva and reached the coast of the Gulf of Finland in the Narva area and further west, the corridor of communication with Finland would be threatened. Finland might start looking for a way out of the war, and Finland's exit meant that in the north, the Soviet Union would free up an army that could be transferred to other directions. This chain of reasoning existed at headquarters, but Hitler had another logic, simpler and cruder. Narva must not be given up, because giving it up would mean admitting that Army Group North no longer held the strategic initiative in the north. And that meant something that German propaganda was not yet ready to say out loud. The order came a few days after German units, fighting, withdrew to the river. Hold Narva. Turn it into a fortress, in the understanding of German military doctrine of 43 to 44. That is, to hold at any cost, without the right to retreat, even in case of complete encirclement. The word Festung in the German army of that period meant not so much a military concept as a political signal. Hitler had personally made the decision, and now it would be carried out as long as a single man stood there. What was at hand was thrown onto the riverbank. The defense in the Narva direction was commanded by General Johannes Friesner, a man with a reputation as a firm and methodical military man. He looked at what was happening soberly enough to understand. The order to hold Narva at any cost was not a military concept, but a political act that shifted onto the troops what headquarters could not resolve. But in a system where disagreement with the Führer entailed consequences ranging from dismissal to execution, soberness of view did not convert into a change of order. The core of the defense was the 3rd SS Panzer Corps under the command of Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner. This formation was not panzer in the usual sense. It had few actual tanks, and not all of them were operational. The word panzer in the names of SS corps of that period meant status rather than content. However, the corps' infantry had been through the hell of the Eastern Front twice, first near Leningrad, then during the winter retreat. These were men accustomed to fighting under conditions where roads disappeared, communications were severed, and neighboring units withdrew without warning. To the Germans were added Estonian volunteer units, the 20th SS Division Estland, and a number of other formations. For the Estonians, Narva held a different dimension. It was not just a sector of the front, it was the border of their country, occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940, and once again turned into a theater of someone else's war. The Estonian soldiers fought with that particular ferocity which arises when a man defends not an abstract strategic line, but a specific shore, a specific city, specific land. But there were few men, catastrophically few. In February 1944, the Soviet side had, on the Narva axis, the 2nd Shock Army under the command of General Feduninsky, approximately 100,000 men in the assault groupings, a significant amount of artillery and tanks. The German and Estonian units tasked with holding the river at their best moment numbered roughly 80,000 men along the entire length of the front, with a serious deficit of anti-tank weapons, aircraft, and heavy artillery. This ratio left no room for illusions about what the balance of losses would be. The first blows came immediately. Soviet troops attempted to force the Narva on the move before the German units had fully occupied their defensive positions. Crossings were attempted in several places simultaneously. In one sector, several Soviet battalions managed to establish themselves on the western bank and create a bridgehead. What began was what military language calls the struggle for a bridgehead. Successive attempts from both sides either to expand it or to eliminate it. In terms of cruelty per unit of area, it is one of the most sanguinary types of combat. Space is limited. Artillery from both sides blankets the same few square kilometers again and again, and men die there where others died yesterday and the day before. The bridgehead was held by Soviet troops for several weeks. German counterattacks shrank it but could not completely eliminate it. At the Army Group headquarters, this was recorded in reports as a stabilization of the front. On the ground, It meant that within a radius of a few kilometers, men were dying daily, in German trenches and in Soviet ones, while the line remained roughly where it was. In February and March 1944, on the banks of the Narva, emerged the type of front that German infantrymen called a positional meat grinder. Not a breakthrough, not a cauldron, not the furious maneuver of armored columns, all that remained in 1941. This was a different war. A war for every strong point, every house, every creek bank. A war in which losses yielded no operational result but simply accumulated, like a debt. To understand the scale of this debt, one figure is needed. In just the first 3 months of fighting at Narva, the German units lost more than 30,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. That is almost the full complement of 3 divisions. Soviet losses were higher, approximately 1.5 times. In total, on this sector of the front in the first 90 days of fighting, more men were killed and maimed than had lived in all of Narva before the war. Meanwhile, the front line had shifted insignificantly. In Berlin's reports, this period was described as the steadfast defense of the Narva line. Technically true, Hitler had not given up the city. The Soviet bridgehead had not expanded to a catastrophic size. Army Group North was still connected to Finland. All of this was true. But something else was also true. The divisions holding this line by the spring of 1944 were combat units at 50 to 70% of their authorized strength, with a large number of wounded returned to duty sooner than medicine prescribed, and with a shortage of experienced non-commissioned officers that could not be made good in 3 months, nor in 6. The 3-month defense broke not the front's back, but the men's. This distinction is fundamental. A front on a map looks like a line. A division in a report looks like a combat-ready unit. But the map does not show that the platoon, which a month ago consisted of 40 men, now numbers 17. And that of these 17, 6 are post-wounded, with incompletely healed fractures and concussions. The report does not show that the company commander has been killed for the 3rd time in a row in 2 months, and his place taken by a sergeant major, fighting since September 1941, and by the spring of 1944, having lost the ability to sleep more than 3 hours without nightmares. The Soviet side also suffered heavy losses, but it had reserves. The Leningrad front received reinforcements in April to May 1944. The German side received practically no reinforcements. The reserves of Army Group North had been used since the start of the year to plug holes elsewhere, and Hitler's headquarters believed that since the front was holding, the current forces were sufficient. This logic is flawed in itself. A front should not just hold, it should have a reserve. Troops that hold without a reserve hold until the first serious blow, and then they have nothing with which to repel it. That is precisely what happened in the summer. But before speaking of summer, one must understand what the land looked like for which such a price was paid. The Narva sector of the front is not a convenient place for defense. It is not heights with good visibility, not fortified cities with stone walls, not a forest massif where positions are easily concealed. It is a river with marshy banks, an industrial city with ruined buildings, and several elevations to the west of the city, called the Sinimäed Hills, translated from Estonian as Blue Mountains, though they resemble mountains no more than any other hills in Estonia, 40 to 70 meters high. It was these hills that became the key to the position. Whoever holds Sinimäe controls the space west of the river. German engineers understood this from the first weeks of the defense. By the spring of 1944, a system of trenches, bunkers, mortar positions, and wire obstacles had been built on the heights, which began to be called the Tannenberg Line in reports. This name borrowed from the German victory of 1914, not for pathos, but for simple propaganda logic. Name a fortification after a victory, and people will think it is impregnable. The Tannenberg Line was strong, but not because it was built for a long time, because it was built well. German defensive engineering by 1944 had reached its peak. Over 3 years of retreats and forced withdrawals, the Germans had learned to set up positions quickly and correctly. The trenches at Sinimäe were dug taking into account dead zones. Firing points covered the approaches to neighboring positions. The system of communication trenches allowed reserves to be moved under fire. For every meter of this line, a price had to be paid, but the Soviet side was prepared to pay. On the Soviet side, the situation was determined by General Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad Front. A pedant and an artilleryman by training, a man accustomed to calculating before firing. In the initial operations, he became convinced that frontal assaults against the German positions at Narva yielded results only at the cost of enormous losses. He then changed his approach: methodical buildup, meticulous preparation of artillery strikes, attempts to probe for weak spots in the defense before committing the infantry. This methodical approach meant that pressure on the German positions did not cease for a single week. Attacks of varying intensity were constant. Sometimes it was a reconnaissance in force by a company or a battalion. Other times it was a full-scale assault by several divisions with artillery preparation. German units never knew what the next day would bring: another reconnaissance jab or the start of a major offensive. This nervous exhaustion was also a form of loss, not in the number of killed, but in the troops' ability to react adequately. By June of '44, the German defense on the Narva line rested on 4 components. The first was the quality of the positions. They were well constructed. The second was the tenacity of the personnel. The men fought fiercely and skillfully despite fatigue. The third was the absence of surprise on the Soviet side. Every major attack was detected by reconnaissance one way or another. The fourth was numerical parity, which was almost gone but was maintained due to the first 3 components. And it was at this very moment that the German command made a mistake it could not later rectify. In late June and early July of 1944, reserves were formed on the Narva axis for a possible withdrawal to a pre-prepared position to the west. General Friesner and the staff of Army Group North understood. The Soviet summer offensive would be large-scale, and with the current balance of forces, holding Narva would become significantly more difficult. Logistically, not mathematically, the reasonable solution was to withdraw to the Tannenberg Line before the blow fell, to preserve manpower and transition to defense on better positions. The request went to Berlin. The reply came quickly. Narva was not to be abandoned. Hitler personally confirmed the order. His logic at that moment was as follows. By July of '44, Finland was already conducting secret negotiations with the Soviet Union on the terms for exiting the war. Under pressure from the Soviet offensive in June of '44, the Finnish army had retreated from the Karelian Isthmus. Berlin understood that Helsinki was seeking a way out. The only argument Germany could use to keep Finland in the war was the promise that Narva would not be surrendered and the northern flank would hold. If Narva fell, Finland would exit the war within weeks. This logic was not without foundation. Finland did indeed exit the war in September of '44, partly because Narva was ultimately abandoned. But the method by which Berlin tried to prevent this exit was destructive for the German troops themselves. The order to hold was accompanied neither by reinforcements nor by any real increase in supplies. It was an order not to retreat without the means to fight. On the 24th of July 1944, Soviet troops delivered a blow that the German staff later called the main blow of the summer of '44 on the Narva axis. The Leningrad front concentrated a significant amount of artillery on a narrow sector. The density of guns per kilometer of front in the main assault zone was approximately 1 gun for every 15 meters. This means that on 1 square kilometer of German positions in the main assault sector, several hundred barrels rained down simultaneously. Such fire does not kill everyone in a trench, but it does to the trenches what cannot be repaired before the next battle. It destroys parapets, blocks communication trenches, cuts telephone lines, disables artillery positions, and produces in men something recorded in medical reports as shell shock, but which is essentially the destruction of the ability to perceive reality and make decisions. After the artillery preparation, the infantry advanced. Here, it is worth citing a specific figure for losses on the first day. On just 1 sector, near the hill designated on German maps as Loritz, the 2 battalions defending it by evening totaled about 60 combat-effective men. They had started the day with more than 500. In less than 8 hours, 2 battalions ceased to exist as combat-effective units. German reserves were thrown in to patch the breach. There were few reserves, precisely because the request for withdrawal and regrouping had been rejected by Berlin weeks earlier. Steiner pulled units from neighboring sectors, which immediately lost stability. While plugging one hole, another formed. This is the classic mechanism of the collapse of a defense built without reserves. It holds as a system while the system is intact, but once one element is torn out, neighboring elements begin to collapse because there is nothing left to rely on. 2 days of fighting gave Soviet troops several kilometers of penetration into the German defense and endangered the entire Narva bridgehead. 3 days, and it became clear that holding the city itself within its former boundaries was already impossible. A withdrawal to the Tannenberg Line on the Cinemae Heights was required, the very maneuver the German command had proposed to carry out in advance and which Hitler had forbidden. Now it had to be done under fire. A withdrawal under fire is a fundamentally different operation from a withdrawal when the front is still stable. In an organized withdrawal, routes of movement, intermediate positions, and covering forces are prepared in advance. In a withdrawal under fire, all these elements exist only to the extent they could be prepared between the first blow and the present moment. On the Narva sector, this meant the following. Units, already depleted, were now moving back along shattered roads, under artillery pursuit, carrying out the wounded, trying not to lose contact with neighboring units, and simultaneously holding defensive positions to prevent Soviet infantry from getting on their backs before they reached new lines. The city of Narva was abandoned in early August of 1944. Many German and Estonian soldiers who had defended here since February saw this as a particular bitterness. For 6 months, men had died to keep Narva German. Now it was being given up, not because it had become impossible, but because it had become impossible to ignore the cost any longer. But those who had paid that price in February, March, April, and May, they could not be brought back. The Cinemae Heights became the new defensive line, the Tannenberg Line. And here occurred what historians of this sector consider one of the most tenacious defensive battles of the final period of the war in the north. The positions on the heights were better than in the city. This was precisely what the German staff had requested permission to withdraw for in advance. The view from the heights was good. The approaches to them were open ground, where Soviet infantry came under fire. German engineering troops had managed to establish a full-fledged system of fortifications here over the previous months, but by this point, there were even fewer men left. The Soviet command delivered several successive blows against the Cinemae line in July and August of '44. Each assault came at a high cost to both sides. The heights changed hands in various sectors. Soviet troops seized and held individual positions for several hours before German counterattacks drove them out. Then artillery again, infantry again, counterattack again. There is one detail that explains much about these battles. The distance between the forward trenches of the German and Soviet defenses in certain sectors of the Cinemae Heights was between 20 and 30 meters. That is less than the length of a garden plot. At such a distance, you can hear people talking in the neighboring trench. Sniper fire is delivered practically point blank. A grenade can be thrown by hand. Every shot is aimed, every mistake is fatal. In German situation reports from this period, a phrase appears again and again. Another attack repelled with heavy losses on both sides. This is neutral military language. It does not convey what the phrase, another attack, meant for the men who had been in these positions for several months already, who buried comrades every week, and understood perfectly well that there was no strategic plan that could make their situation less dangerous. The order to hold was not accompanied by the prospect of reinforcements or any clear objective beyond the very act of holding itself. The soldiers who fought on the Cinemae Heights were mostly men with extensive frontline experience. 3 years on the Eastern Front develop instincts that cannot be acquired in any training camp. The skill to dig in within minutes on any terrain. The ability to sense a change in the artillery rhythm, when it's reconnaissance fire, when it's preparation for an attack, when it's a barrage. The ability to fight in a situation where there is no communication, the neighboring units are unknown, and the map does not match what you see in front of you. These men possessed all of this, but experience does not replace numbers. When a company numbers 20 men, it cannot hold a position designed for 80, no matter how experienced those 20 are. The Soviet side suffered no lesser losses, but it had fresh divisions that were committed to battle to replace exhausted ones. The German front had no such rotation. The men who stood on the Sinimé Heights at the end of August had, for the most part, been standing there since February. They had seen 8 months of continuous combat. And then occurred what headquarters referred to as a change in the strategic situation. On the 4th of September 1944, Finland concluded an armistice with the Soviet Union. It left the war. The very political reason for which Hitler had forbidden retreat from Narva vanished. The northern flank, which had to be held for Finland's sake, lost its meaning the moment Finland signed the armistice. Berlin belatedly permitted what the German command had been requesting since June, a withdrawal from the Narva line to positions on Latvian territory. The retreat began on the night of the 16th to the 17th of September, 1944. By this time, the units that had defended Narva since February had lost between 40 and 70% of their original strength in killed, wounded, and captured, depending on the specific formation. Total German losses on the Narva axis from February to September 44 exceeded 60,000 men. Soviet losses were higher, according to various estimates, between 90 and 120,000 killed and wounded for the same period. In total, 200,000 men, for a sector of the front that was ultimately abandoned not as a result of military defeat, but due to a political decision by Finland. This arithmetic demands a pause. The Narva operation is not a story that fits conveniently into standard narratives of the Second World War. The Germans did not lose here in the usual sense. They were not encircled, not destroyed, not defeated in open battle. Soviet troops did not achieve a clean victory. They suffered heavy losses, spent months battering the defense line, and ultimately occupied Narva not as a result of a decisive breakthrough, but after the enemy received permission to leave. What happened at Narva in 1944 is a story about the gap between an order and the possibility of carrying it out. About a situation where political considerations dictate military decisions, having no relation to the actual condition of the troops tasked with executing them. Hitler forbade retreat from Narva because he wanted to keep Finland in the war. Finland left the war in September. Narva was abandoned in September. Everything that happened between February and September, costing 200,000 casualties on both sides, did not alter the final outcome by a single political decision. But it did change something else. It changed the fact that on this sector of the front, those divisions that fought here in February no longer exist. They were ground down. The men are dead or maimed. The experience accumulated over 3 years on the Eastern Front, the experience American generals later wrote about with admiration, is gone. There is nowhere to pass it on because there is no one left to pass it to. This is precisely what happens when an order exists, but the possibility of carrying it out does not. There are several versions as to why the German command did not take more decisive steps to get the order changed at a time when it still would have made sense, in May or June of '44. General Friesner, for example, later described in his memoirs his attempts to convince headquarters of the hopelessness of holding Narva. He said he reported on the condition of the troops with utmost accuracy. The question is not whether he reported or not. The question is different. How is a system structured in which a truthful report about the real state of affairs does not change the decision at the top of that system? The German command system in '44 had one systemic flaw it could no longer overcome. Hitler increasingly made decisions not based on military logic, but on political considerations, fears, and convictions that were not corrected even by obvious facts from the front. The decision to hold Narva was made not because military advisors considered it possible. It was made because Hitler considered it politically necessary. This difference between militarily possible and politically necessary cost 60,000 German soldiers on one sector of the front. But Narva is not only a German story. There is another perspective, one less often included in general descriptions of this campaign. The perspective of the Soviet soldiers who were to attack the Tannenberg Line. They knew what awaited them there. Combat reconnaissance under these conditions provided sufficient information to understand. The fortifications were serious, the defense was deep, and each attack on the Sinimé Heights would come at the cost of heavy losses. Soviet mid- and low-level commanders had no possibility of refusing the order to attack, just as German commanders had no possibility of refusing the order to hold. The price of this dual impossibility was precisely those 120,000 Soviet casualties. The war at Narva was a war of two armies, each executing orders without the right to question them. The difference was that the Soviet side had reserves and ultimately achieved its objective. The German side had no reserves and held only for the time allotted to them. To understand what combat work on this sector actually looked like, there is one detail rarely mentioned in general descriptions of the Narva campaign. On the Sinimäed Heights during certain periods of the fighting, the expenditure of artillery shells on the Soviet side amounted to several 100,000 rounds per day for the entire Leningrad front. These are colossal figures for a single sector. On the German side, the shell famine by August 1944 was so severe that individual batteries received a daily limit on the number of rounds, making full-fledged counter-battery warfare impossible. That is, Soviet artillery could operate at full strength. German artillery could not. And yet, the German positions held. This says something important about the quality of German defensive engineering and the training of the men manning those positions. But it also speaks of the price. To hold under such fire without the ability to fully respond means to suffer irreplaceable losses and to wait for the moment when the next attack wave will be the last. The last such wave occurred on the 24th to 26th of July, 1944. Soviet troops breached the positions near the city, and the German defense began shifting towards Sinimäe, from where an organized withdrawal to Latvia followed in September, after the Finnish armistice. After the war, the German and Estonian veteran communities established several memorial sites on the Sinimäed Heights. The Soviet side created its own. On one small patch of Estonian land, several cemeteries are concentrated: German, Estonian, Soviet. The people buried within a few hundred meters of each other died fighting one another for a sector of the front that ultimately proved decisive for none of the great powers. Estonia, for whose land people died here, found itself again part of the USSR in September 44. Those who fought on the side of the German forces in the hope of preserving at least some version of independence did not achieve their goal. Those who fought on the Soviet side conquered territory for a state that had always considered this territory its own by right, not by victory. The question that finds no answer at Narva is not a military one. The war at Narva was decided by logistics, reserves, and political decisions in Berlin and Helsinki. All of this is beyond the trench. All of this happened thousands of kilometers away from the man sitting in the earth on the Sinimäed Heights, who knew only that tomorrow there would be another artillery barrage and the infantry would go forward again. The question that remains is, what exactly did the 6-month order not to retreat decide? It did not hold Finland. It did not change the balance of forces on the Eastern Front. It did not prevent the retreat of Army Group North into Latvia, which happened in the autumn of 1944 regardless. It did not alter the outcome of the war in any direction. It only determined precisely how many people, from the German and Soviet, Estonian and Russian sides, died between February and September of 1944 on the banks of the river, at the foot of the hills called Blue, though in 44 they were any color but blue. The price of the order at Narva is the answer to a question the order itself never asked. Every time politics formulates a military task without regard for what is actually happening in the troops, such a price appears. Sometimes it is measured in weeks of futile fighting. At Narva, it was measured in 7 months and 200,000 killed and maimed, and by no result that would correspond to it.